The grand ballroom of the Astoria Plaza gleamed under an ocean of golden chandeliers. The air buzzed with the sound of clinking champagne glasses and polite laughter as the city's wealthiest elites wove through the space in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Every detail of the event, from the cascading floral arrangements to the live orchestra softly playing in the corner, screamed exclusivity. It was a night meant only for the privileged, a celebration of power and influence. Maria Rodriguez stepped inside, her presence unnoticed at first. Unlike the other guests, she wore no glittering jewels or extravagant attire. Her simple black dress, though elegant, lacked the flashiness of the others. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her dark eyes scanning the room with a gaze that held both fondness and sorrow. She had been here before, many times in fact. She knew this place intimately, though no one here knew her. This ballroom, this building, had once been her childhood playground. Long before it became the city's premier luxury venue, it had been her family's property. The Rodriguez estate, built from generations of hard work, had stood as a legacy in her family's name. But after her father's passing, a bitter legal battle and underhanded deals had pushed Maria to the sidelines. She had inherited it, yes, but those who once worked for her family had conveniently chosen to forget that fact. Now, she stood among them. These self-proclaimed elites, these people who laughed and toasted in her building, as nothing more than an outsider. Maria moved quietly through the crowd, observing everything. The guests didn't spare her a second glance. To them, she was invisible. Perhaps a +1 to some mid-tier businessman, or worse, an intruder who had somehow slipped past security. It was ironic, really. The very people enjoying the luxury of her family's property had no idea she was its rightful owner. A waiter passed by, offering her a tray of champagne, but Maria declined with a polite shake of her head. This was not a night for celebrating. She wasn't here to drink, dance, or bask in luxury. She was here to see, to remember, and, if the night unfolded the way she expected, to reclaim what was hers. Maria felt the weight of curious glances pressing against her like an invisible force. The moment of being unnoticed had passed. Now people were watching. It started subtly. A well-dressed woman whispered into her husband's ear, eyes flicking toward Maria before looking away with mild disgust. A man near the bar cast a puzzled glance, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and annoyance. To them, she didn't belong. The unspoken rules of wealth and exclusivity had been broken by her mere presence. She ignored them and continued walking, her fingers grazing the polished railing along the edge of the ballroom's grand staircase. This was hers. She had every right to be here. But then came the real problem. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a black suit emerged from the crowd, moving with purpose. His earpiece and the slight bulge beneath his jacket screamed security detail. Maria recognized the authoritative look in his eyes even before he spoke. "Ma'am," he said firmly, stepping in front of her path. His badge glinted under the chandelier's glow. Jake Thompson, head of security. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Maria remained composed. "Excuse me?" Jake's expression remained cold, professional. "This is an exclusive event. If you're not on the guest list, I'm afraid you can't be here." A few guests nearby paused their conversations, pretending not to watch, but clearly listening. "I don't need to be on a guest list," Maria said, her voice steady. "I have every right to be here." Jake's eyes darkened. "That's so?" His gaze raked over her modest attire, skepticism plain on his face. "Look, I don't know how you got in, but this isn't a public event. Let's not make a scene, all right? Just step outside." Maria let out a slow breath, keeping her frustration in check. "Mr. Thompson, if you'd listen for a second—" "I don't need to listen," Jake interrupted, his voice growing firmer. He took a step closer, a silent warning. "You either walk out or I escort you out. Your choice." A murmur rippled through the guests around them. The tension thickened, anticipation gleaming in their eyes. They wanted to see a spectacle. Maria clenched her jaw. She had tried to be civil. She had tried to be reasonable. But Jake Thompson had just made a very, very big mistake. A hush settled over the room, broken only by the occasional murmurs and quiet snickers of the guests. They watched with amused curiosity as Maria stood her ground against Jake Thompson. "Is she serious?" a woman whispered behind her. "She looks lost," a man chuckled, sipping his champagne. "I told you she didn't belong," another guest murmured to his companion. Maria ignored them. She had faced worse in her life than the judgmental eyes of the elite, but Jake, emboldened by the silent approval of the crowd, wasn't done yet. "I'm not asking again," Jake said, his patience clearly worn thin. He signaled to two security guards standing nearby. Before Maria could respond, they grabbed her by the arms. "Hey!" she protested, but the men didn't listen. The guests gasped, but no one intervened. If anything, the spectacle entertained them. With forceful shoves, the security team dragged Maria toward the grand entrance, her heels skidding against the marble floor. The humiliation burned in her chest, but she remained silent, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. The towering double doors were thrown open, and the cold night air rushed against her skin. With one final push, she was sent stumbling out onto the pavement. The doors slammed shut behind her. For a moment, Maria simply stood there, the golden glow of the ballroom spilling onto the sidewalk, contrasting against the harsh reality of her exile. Her fists clenched at her sides. Then, a familiar voice rang out from down the street. "Maria?" She turned to see Ethan Parker, her assistant, rushing toward her. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he looked every bit like he belonged inside that ballroom, unlike the woman they had just tossed out. His eyes widened in horror as he took in the scene. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan demanded, his voice cutting through the night. He stormed up the steps, fixing the security guards with an icy glare. "This woman was trespassing," Jake said smugly, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. Ethan scoffed, his disbelief quickly turning to fury. "Trespassing?" he repeated, then turned to Maria, his brows furrowed. "Did they seriously?" Maria nodded once, lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan exhaled sharply before looking back at Jake, his voice sharp enough to slice through glass. "You complete idiot," he seethed. "Do you have any idea who this woman is?" Jake's smug expression faltered slightly. "She owns this building." A stunned silence followed Ethan's words. Jake Thompson's smirk vanished in an instant. His posture stiffened, his confidence crumbling, as his mind scrambled to process what he had just heard. The woman he had thrown out, humiliated in front of dozens of high society guests, was the rightful owner of the very building they were standing in. Before Jake could react, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the entrance. The venue manager, a balding man in an expensive suit, burst through the doors, his face pale as if he had just seen a ghost. His panicked gaze landed on Maria, standing outside with Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Rodriguez!" he exclaimed, breathless. "Oh my God! I had no idea you were here." Jake visibly tensed. Several guests who had wandered toward the entrance, drawn in by the commotion, gasped in recognition as well. Maria tilted her head slightly, arms crossed over her chest. "Interesting," she said coolly. "Because your security certainly seemed to think I had no place here." The manager's eyes darted between Maria and Jake, realization dawning in real time. He turned sharply to the head of security. "What have you done?" the manager hissed. Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time that night, he was at a complete loss. Maria stepped forward, and though she spoke softly, her words carried an unmistakable authority. "For those of you who don't know," she said, addressing the stunned guests gathered around, "my family built this building. The Rodriguez estate has owned it for generations. And when my father passed, that ownership was passed down to me." A few gasps sounded from the crowd. "I may not be draped in diamonds or parading my wealth," Maria continued, eyes locking onto Jake's, "but I don't need to. This place, it's mine." Jake swallowed hard, looking like he wanted to sink into the floor. The manager turned back to Maria, his voice trembling with apology. Ms. Rodriguez, please, I deeply regret this misunderstanding. Had I known you were attending— Maria held up a hand, silencing him. That's exactly the problem, she said. You and your staff assumed. You saw a woman who didn't fit your definition of worthy and threw her out without a second thought. The guests, once amused by the spectacle, now shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. The mockery, the judgment, it had all backfired spectacularly. Jake, his face now an alarming shade of red, could do nothing but stand in disgrace, knowing there was no undoing his mistake. Maria took a deep breath, then turned on her heel and strode back inside. The golden chandeliers still glowed, the champagne still flowed, and the orchestra still played. But the mood had shifted. The same people who had whispered about her, laughed at her, watched as she was thrown out like an intruder, now parted in silence as she walked through the ballroom. The power dynamic had flipped. Maria didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was enough to send a wave of shame through the crowd. The murmured gossip had turned into panicked whispers, guests suddenly realizing that they had mocked the very person who owned the building they were standing in. Ethan followed at her side, giving Jake Thompson a final withering glare. The head of security stood frozen near the entrance, his expression one of pure dread. He knew what was coming. Maria stopped in front of him, her posture calm, composed, but uncompromising. "You're fired," she said simply. Jake's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Ms. Rodriguez, You embarrassed me, humiliated me, and physically threw me out of my own property without bothering to listen," Maria continued, her voice sharp yet controlled. "That tells me everything I need to know about your judgment. You're done here." A hush fell over the room as Jake's fate was sealed. His face burned with humiliation, but he could do nothing. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his once confident stride now defeated. Maria, satisfied, continued toward the center of the ballroom. This night had already been a spectacle. Why not take it one step further? She stepped onto the small stage near the orchestra, where a microphone stood. The band trailed off into silence, all eyes now focused on her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing through the hall. "I'm sure you all just witnessed an unfortunate incident, but let me be clear, I'm not here to demand apologies or call out individuals. I'm here to talk about change." The guests held their breath. "This building was meant to be a place of legacy, beauty, and inclusion," she continued. "But somewhere along the way, it became a place where people are judged by their appearances rather than their worth. That ends today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Starting immediately, I will be revamping the venue's policies to ensure that no one, whether guest, staff, or owner, will ever be treated the way I was tonight." The weight of her words settled over the room. And then, from somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands clapped. Then another. And then the entire ballroom erupted into applause. The sound of applause filled the grand ballroom, reverberating off the high ceilings. It started hesitantly, just a few scattered claps. But then, as the weight of Maria's words settled in, the applause grew louder. The same guests who had whispered behind her back, who had mocked her as an outsider, now looked at her with newfound respect. Some even stood, nodding in approval. Their expressions ranged from admiration to guilt, realizing how easily they had misjudged her based solely on appearance. Maria took in their reactions with quiet satisfaction. She wasn't looking for their validation, but it was clear her message had been heard. Meanwhile, Jake Thompson stood near the entrance, watching it all unfold. He shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance now completely stripped away. He had spent the night enforcing exclusivity, making snap judgments, and treating Maria as though she were beneath him, only to learn, in the most humiliating way possible, that she was the most important person in the building. His downfall had been swift and public, and there was no coming back from it. With one last look at Maria, his expression a mix of regret and shame, he turned and walked out, his departure barely noticed by the guests who had already moved on. Maria, now standing confidently at the center of the room, let out a slow breath. This was her moment. She picked up the microphone once more. "I want to make one thing clear," she said, her voice steady but filled with warmth. "This building is not just a monument to wealth or exclusivity. It is a place of history, community, and opportunity." She glanced around the room, making eye contact with the guests. "From this moment forward, the Rodriguez estate will not be a place where people are judged by their clothes, their status, or their bank accounts. It will be a place for everyone." A second wave of applause erupted, louder and more genuine this time. Ethan, standing at her side, smiled with pride. "You did it," he murmured. Maria smiled back, feeling the weight of years of injustice begin to lift from her shoulders. She had reclaimed more than just her property tonight. She had reclaimed her legacy. As the orchestra resumed playing, and guests eagerly approached to offer their apologies and congratulations, Maria took one last glance around the ballroom. It was hers again. And this time, she was going to make sure it truly belonged to everyone. Maria stepped out onto the grand balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Below her, the city stretched out in a sea of lights, buildings towering like monuments of ambition, streets alive with movement and purpose. This was her city, her home, and tonight, she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. She rested her hands on the ornate railing, running her fingers over the intricate carvings. This building had once belonged to her family, a symbol of their legacy, until it had been taken from her. For years she had been pushed aside, dismissed as irrelevant, overlooked by the very people who had benefited from her father's work. But no more. Tonight, she had walked back into her own home unrecognized, unwelcomed, treated like she was beneath the very walls her family had built. But she had endured the humiliation, turned the judgment of others into a lesson, and now she stood here, victorious. Inside, the grand ballroom was still alive with murmurs of conversation, music drifting softly into the night. She could hear the occasional laughter and the clinking of glasses, the same sounds that had once signified exclusivity and power. But now they carried a different meaning. The guests had learned something tonight about her, about assumptions, about the real meaning of ownership. Ethan joined her on the balcony, standing beside her with a quiet smile. "Quite the night," he said, resting his elbows on the railing. Maria chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it." "You handled it well." Ethan glanced at her, admiration in his eyes. "Better than most would have." She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. The old Maria, the one who had watched silently as her family's legacy slipped through her fingers, might have crumbled under the weight of injustice. But the woman standing here tonight had changed. She had fought back, with dignity and grace, and she had won. "This place will be different now," she said, gazing at the city skyline. "No more gatekeeping, no more exclusivity for the sake of status. It will be a place where everyone is welcome, regardless of how they look or where they come from." Ethan nodded. "Your father would be proud." Maria smiled, her eyes shining with quiet satisfaction. Yes, he would. She took one last deep breath, inhaling the crisp night air. Below her, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the battle that had been fought and won within these walls. But Maria knew, and that was enough.